What would you do if the system you helped build suddenly turned against everything you believe in, and staying silent was no longer enough to survive? Thomas More wasn't just a philosopher imagining a perfect society. He was a man inside real power, forced to choose between loyalty and truth. And the decision he made didn't just cost him his position, it cost him his life. Thomas More was born in 1478 in London, into a world that was beginning to shift in ways few could fully understand at the time. The late medieval order, shaped by tradition, religion, and rigid hierarchy, was slowly giving way to something new. Trade was expanding, ideas were moving more freely, and the early signs of what would become the modern world were beginning to appear. But this transition was not smooth. It created tension, uncertainty, and deep questions about how society should be structured. From an early age, More was drawn into both intellectual and public life. He received a strong education, studying classical literature, philosophy, and law. Unlike thinkers who remained removed from politics, he moved directly into it, becoming a lawyer and eventually serving in positions close to the center of power. This dual position, both thinker and participant, would define his entire life. What makes him particularly significant is that he did not simply observe society from a distance. He experienced its structure from within, seeing both its ideals and its failures. This gave his thinking a practical edge. He was not imagining a world in isolation. He was responding to one that already existed, with all its contradictions. At the center of his legacy is a single work that would define his name across centuries. A book that presents not just a story, but a challenge to how society is understood. Utopia. The word itself suggests something that does not exist, and yet the ideas within it feel uncomfortably close to reality. In this work, he describes an imagined society, one that operates according to principles very different from those of the Europe he lived in. In this society, private property does not exist. Wealth is not concentrated in the hands of a few. People work, but not endlessly. Resources are shared, and the structure of life is designed to reduce inequality rather than reinforce it. At first glance, this might seem like a simple ideal, a vision of fairness and balance. But his approach is more complex than that. He does not present this society as a perfect solution without tension. Instead, he uses it as a way to expose the problems of his own world. By describing a system where greed, corruption, and extreme inequality are minimized, he forces the reader to confront how deeply those issues are embedded in reality. The contrast is not meant to comfort. It is meant to reveal. He also explores how law functions within such a society. In his imagined world, laws are simple, clear, and few. People do not need a complex legal system because the structure of society itself reduces the conditions that lead to crime. This stands in contrast to his own time, where laws were often harsh, complicated, and unevenly applied. This idea reflects a deeper belief that problems in society are not always the result of individual failure, but of the structures that shape behavior. When conditions create inequality and desperation, crime follows. Changing the structure changes the outcome. At the same time, his vision raises difficult questions. If property is shared and life is structured collectively, what happens to individual freedom? How much control does society have over the individual? Where's the balance between order and independence? He does not resolve these questions completely. Instead, he leaves them open, creating a tension within his work. Utopia is not simply an ideal to be adopted. It is a space for reflection where the strengths and weaknesses of different systems can be examined. Beyond his writing, his life itself becomes part of the philosophy he represents. As he rose in political power, eventually becoming a key advisor to King Henry VIII, he found himself in a position where ideas and authority intersected directly. This is where his story takes a more serious turn. The political and religious landscape of England began to change rapidly. The king sought to separate from the authority of the church in Rome, a decision that would reshape the country's structure. Many supported this shift, either out of agreement or necessity. More than not, his refusal was not impulsive. It was grounded in his belief that certain principles could not be adjusted for convenience or power. This placed him in direct conflict with the authority he had served. What follows is not just a political disagreement, but a test of alignment between belief and action. He was asked to accept a position he did not agree with, to adapt his stance to fit the changing structure of power. He refused. This refusal had consequences. He was removed from his position, charged, and eventually sentenced to death. His final moments are often remembered not for dramatic resistance, but for a quiet consistency. He did not attempt to escape or reverse his position. He remained aligned with what he believed, even when the outcome was clear. This part of his life adds a different dimension to his philosophy. It moves it beyond writing and into action. It shows what it means to hold to a principle when it becomes costly. By the time his life came to an end in 1535, he had left behind more than a book or a set of ideas. He had left an example of how those ideas interact with reality, where compromise, pressure, and consequence are unavoidable. What remains is not a simple message. His work does not provide a clear model to follow without question. Instead, it creates a space of tension between ideal and reality, between structure and freedom, between belief and survival. And within that tension lies the enduring impact of his thought. It does not settle easily. It continues to challenge, not by offering final answers, but by forcing a closer look at the systems people live within and the principles they are willing or unwilling to stand by when those systems begin to shift. As his ideas continue to unfold beyond the surface of Utopia, what becomes clearer is that Thomas More was not simply imagining a better society. He was quietly dissecting the one he lived in. The fictional island is not just an invention. It is a mirror, carefully constructed to reflect the flaws, contradictions, and hidden assumptions of early modern Europe. To understand the depth of his thinking, it is necessary to look at what he is actually doing beneath the narrative. He is not offering a direct argument in the usual sense. Instead, he creates distance. He describes another place, another system, another way of living, and through that distance, he makes the familiar appear strange. This technique allows him to question ideas that would otherwise be accepted without thought. Private property, for example, is not presented as a natural or necessary feature of society. In Utopia, it simply does not exist. And yet the society continues to function, in some ways more smoothly than his own. This raises a difficult question. If a society can function without private ownership, then why is it so central in reality? Is it truly necessary, or is it simply assumed to be? He does not answer this directly. Instead, he allows the comparison to do the work. The reader is left to confront the possibility that what feels essential may actually be contingent, shaped by history and habit rather than necessity. At the same time, he explores the relationship between wealth and inequality with a level of clarity that feels almost modern. In his own society, wealth was concentrated and poverty was widespread. Punishments for theft were severe, even when the theft itself was driven by need. He points out the contradiction. A society that creates conditions where people are driven to steal and then punishes them harshly for it is not solving the problem, is reinforcing it. In Utopia, this cycle is broken by removing the conditions that produce it. When resources are shared and basic needs are met, the motivation for certain kinds of crime diminishes. This does not eliminate all problems, but it changes their structure. This reflects a deeper shift in thinking. Instead of focusing only on individual responsibility, he begins to consider systemic responsibility. Behavior is not isolated. It is shaped by the environment in which it occurs. This idea extends into how work is organized. In Utopia, everyone contributes, but no one is overburdened. Work is distributed in a way that allows time for learning, reflection, and rest. This stands in contrast to a system where labor is unevenly distributed and many are forced into exhausting conditions simply to survive. Here again, the contrast is deliberate. It is not simply about imagining comfort. It is about questioning why imbalance is accepted as normal. At the same time, his vision introduces its own complexities. The society he describes is highly structured. Daily life is organized. Movement can be regulated, and individual choices are often shaped by the needs of the community. This creates a tension that he does not resolve. A society that reduces inequality may also reduce certain forms of freedom. The question becomes how much structure is necessary, and at what point structure becomes restriction. He does not provide a final answer, but the tension itself is important. It forces a closer examination of trade-offs that are often ignored. Every system prioritizes something, and those priorities shape both its strengths and its limitations. Beyond the structure of society, he also reflects on human nature in a subtle way. He does not assume that people are naturally good or naturally selfish. Instead, he suggests that behavior is flexible, influenced by conditions, expectations, and incentives. When a system rewards accumulation and competition, people tend to behave in ways that reflect those values. When a system emphasizes cooperation and balance, behavior begins to shift in that direction. This does not remove responsibility from individuals, but it complicates it. It suggests that understanding behavior requires looking beyond personal choice and into the structure that surrounds it. At the same time, his work remains intentionally ambiguous. It is not entirely clear whether Utopia is meant to be taken as a serious proposal, a critique, or something in between. Some elements seem ideal, while others appear restrictive or even unrealistic. This ambiguity is not accidental. It allows the work to function on multiple levels. It can be read as a vision, as a warning, or as a question. And perhaps that is the point. By refusing to present a single, clear conclusion, he keeps the reader engaged in the process of thinking. The goal is not to accept Utopia as it is, but to use it as a tool to examine reality more closely. As his ideas develop further, what emerges is not a fixed model of the perfect society, but a method of questioning, a way of stepping outside familiar structures and asking whether they are necessary, whether they are just, and whether they could be otherwise. This method becomes one of his most lasting contributions. It shifts the focus from accepting systems as given to examining them as constructed. And within that shift lies a deeper implication, that the way a society is organized is not inevitable. It is shaped by choices, by values, and by assumptions that can be questioned, challenged, and potentially changed. By this stage, his philosophy has moved beyond description into something more active. It does not simply present ideas. It invites reflection, comparison, and doubt. And once that process begins, it becomes difficult to look at any system, whether political, economic, or social, in the same way again. As his thought continues to deepen, what begins to stand out more clearly is that Thomas More was not only questioning external systems like wealth, law, and governance, but also the deeper assumptions people hold about human life itself. Beneath the structure of Utopia lies a more subtle inquiry, one that moves beyond politics into the nature of happiness, purpose, and what it actually means to live well. In his imagined society, life is not organized around endless accumulation or constant competition. Instead, there is a deliberate attempt to create conditions where people can pursue a more stable and thoughtful existence. Work exists, but it does not dominate every aspect of life. Time is left for learning, reflection, and intellectual engagement. This introduces a different understanding of value. In many societies, value is tied to productivity, status, or possession. But in Utopia, value begins to shift toward balance, knowledge, and the quality of experience. The goal is not to maximize output, but to create a life that is sustainable and meaningful over time. At the same time, he explores the idea of pleasure, but not in a simplistic or purely indulgent sense. Pleasure, in his framework, is connected to well-being, to health, to peace of mind, and to the absence of unnecessary suffering. It is not about excess. It is about alignment. This creates a more nuanced view of human desire. Instead of treating desire as something that must always be satisfied or suppressed, he suggests that it can be shaped. What people seek is influenced by the conditions they live in. When a society encourages accumulation and comparison, desires expand in those directions. When a society encourages balance, desires begin to adjust. This perspective reinforces his broader point about structure. Human behavior is not fixed. It responds to the environment. Change the environment, and behavior begins to change as well. However, as his vision becomes more detailed, the tension within it also becomes more visible. The same structures that create balance can also create limitation. In Utopia, life is carefully organized. Schedules exist, expectations are clear, and there is a strong emphasis on conformity to shared norms. This raises an important question. If a society is too structured, does it leave room for individuality? Can a system that prioritizes balance also allow for difference, for deviation, for personal freedom that does not always align with collective goals? He does not resolve this tension directly. Instead, he allows it to remain present, almost as if it is unavoidable. Every system must balance competing values, order and freedom, equality and individuality, stability and change. This unresolved tension gives his work its lasting depth. It does not present a perfect solution. It exposes the difficulty of creating one. At the same time, his thinking begins to move more clearly into the realm of ethics, not just in terms of laws or rules, but in terms of how individuals relate to truth, to authority, and to their own conscience. This becomes especially significant when viewed alongside his life. As he rose in political power, he was placed in situations where compromise was expected. Decisions had to be made within systems that were not ideal, where maintaining position often required adjusting beliefs. This is where his philosophy is tested. He was not living in utopia. He was operating within a real structure, one shaped by power, pressure, and changing political forces. The question becomes how a person who understands the flaws of a system continues to exist within it. For a time, he navigated this balance. He served, advised, and participated in governance. But as the situation in England changed, particularly with the king's break from the established religious authority, the tension between belief and position became impossible to ignore. What he faced was not a theoretical question, but a practical one: whether to align with power or remain consistent with his convictions. His refusal was not dramatic in its expression, but it was absolute in its direction. He did not openly rebel, but he did not agree. He remained silent where agreement was expected, and that silence itself became a form of resistance. This moment reveals something essential about his philosophy. It is not only about how societies should be structured. It is about how individuals respond when those structures conflict with their principles. There is no ideal system that removes this tension entirely. Even in the most balanced society, there will be moments where personal judgment and external expectation do not align. By this stage, his thought moves beyond imagining better systems into confronting the limits of all systems. No structure can fully eliminate conflict. No arrangement can resolve every tension. What remains, then, is the role of the individual within those limits. A person must decide what they are willing to accept, what they are willing to question, and where they draw the line between adaptation and integrity. This does not provide an easy answer. It introduces a responsibility, and within that responsibility lies the deeper impact of his philosophy. It does not simply ask what kind of world should exist. It asks what kind of person one chooses to be within whatever world exists. Because even the most carefully designed system cannot replace that decision. And once that question is faced directly, the focus begins to shift, away from abstract ideals alone, and toward the lived reality of choice, consequence, and the quiet, often difficult alignment between what one believes and how one acts. As his life approached its final stage, what becomes most striking is how completely Thomas More's ideas and actions begin to merge. Up to this point, his work had explored systems, questioned structures, and examine the tension between ideal societies and real ones. But in the end, that tension becomes personal. It is no longer something he observed from a distance. It is something he is forced to live through directly. The political landscape around him had shifted in a way that could not be ignored. Authority was no longer stable, and a relationship between power and belief had become uncertain. The king's decision to redefine religious authority was not just a political act. It demanded a response from those within the system, especially from those close to power. For many, the choice was pragmatic. Align with a new structure, adapt, and continue. The system changes, and individuals adjust with it. This is how most political transitions function. Stability is maintained through adaptation. But for more, the situation exposed something deeper. The question was no longer about governance or policy. It was about whether belief could be adjusted to fit power or whether there were limits that could not be crossed. His refusal did not come from impulsiveness or rebellion. It came from a consistent line that had been present in his thinking all along, that certain principles are not negotiable, even when the cost of holding them becomes severe. What makes this moment significant is not just the decision itself, but the context in which it is made. He was not an outsider resisting authority. He was part of the system, someone who had benefited from it, worked within it, and understood its complexities. This makes his refusal more difficult. It is easier to oppose something from the outside than to withdraw from it when one is already deeply embedded within it. As the consequences of his decision unfolded, the tension between individual conscience and external authority became fully visible. He was asked to conform, not through force alone, but through expectation. Agreement was treated as a necessity, not a choice. His silence became the defining act. He did not openly attack the system, but he did not support it either. And in a structure that required affirmation, silence itself was interpreted as resistance. This moment captures something essential about the limits of systems. No matter how powerful or structured they are, they cannot fully control internal conviction. They can demand compliance, but they cannot produce genuine agreement. At the same time, his position reveals the cost of maintaining that internal alignment. It is not abstract. It is not symbolic. It carries real consequences: loss of position, isolation, and ultimately, death. This is where his philosophy moves beyond theory in its most complete form. It becomes a lived example of the tension he had explored throughout his work. The gap between ideal and reality, between structure and principle, is no longer something to analyze. It is something to endure. His execution in 1535 does not resolve the questions he raised. If anything, it sharpens them. It forces a confrontation with the limits of both ideal systems and real ones. Utopia, as a vision, presents a structured society designed to reduce inequality and create balance. But even such a system cannot remove the fundamental tension between the individual and authority. There will always be moments where alignment is tested. This realization adds a deeper layer to his work. It suggests that no system, no matter how well designed, can fully eliminate conflict. There will always be points where personal conviction and external expectation diverge. What remains, then, is not the search for a perfect system, but the recognition of this tension as an unavoidable part of human life. At the same time, his legacy begins to take shape beyond his own time. His ideas continue to influence political thought, discussions about justice, equality, and the role of structure in shaping behavior. But equally important is the example he leaves behind, not as a figure of perfection, but as a point of reflection. His life shows what happens when ideas are carried to their limits. When questioning systems leads not just to thought, but to action. When the cost of alignment becomes real, and it leaves behind a question that does not fade easily. Not what the ideal society looks like, but what an individual does when the society they live in no longer aligns with what they believe. This question does not belong only to his time. It repeats in different forms across history, in different systems, under different conditions. It does not have a single answer, because every situation carries its own complexities. But the presence of the question remains constant. By the end of his life, Thomas More had moved from imagining a different world to confronting the limits of the one he lived in. And in doing so, he revealed something that goes beyond any single system or idea, that the tension between belief and reality cannot be fully removed. It can only be faced. And once it is faced, the focus shifts, away from abstract ideals alone and toward the quiet, often difficult decision of how to act when those ideals are no longer supported by the world around them. Because in the end, what defines a philosophy is not only what it says about the world, but what it demands when the world refuses to match it. Thomas More begins his philosophy not with abstract metaphysics, but with a problem that is immediately visible in the world around him, a society that claims to be ordered and just, yet is filled with inequality, corruption, and quiet forms of suffering that are treated as normal. He does not begin by asking what reality is made of, but by asking how human life is organized and why that organization so often fails the very people it is meant to serve. His thought emerges from a tension between what exists and what could exist. He looks at the institutions of his time, the laws, the systems of property, the punishments, and the distribution of wealth, and sees not a natural or necessary order, but a constructed one, shaped by human decisions that could have been different. This realization becomes the starting point. If the structure of society is not fixed, then it can be questioned, and if it can be questioned, it can be reimagined. From this point, he begins to develop a way of thinking that is both critical and constructive. He does not simply reject the existing system. He exposes its contradictions. A society that punishes theft harshly while allowing extreme poverty creates the very conditions that lead to crime. Laws that appear to protect order often protect privilege. What is presented as justice may in fact be a form of imbalance sustained by habit and authority. This critique leads to a deeper question about the relationship between morality and structure. It is not enough to expect individuals to behave well if the system within which they live encourages imbalance. A society that concentrates wealth, limits opportunity, and creates desperation cannot rely on moral instruction alone. The conditions of life shape behavior as much as personal choice does. From here, Thomas More introduces the idea that justice must be embedded in the structure of society itself. It cannot be an afterthought. It must be part of how resources are distributed, how work is organized, and how people relate to one another within the system. This leads him toward a radical idea for his time, that private property, as it exists, may be one of the central causes of inequality. In his view, when wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few, it creates a division that affects every aspect of life. Those with excess live in security and comfort, while those without struggle to meet basic needs. This imbalance does not remain economic. It becomes social and moral, shaping relationships, opportunities, and even the way people understand their own worth. To explore an alternative, he presents a vision of a different kind of society, one where property is held in common, where resources are shared, and where the basic needs of all are met without the pressure of competition for survival. This is not presented as a perfect or final system, but as a way of examining what society might look like if it were organized around balance rather than accumulation. In this imagined structure, work is distributed more evenly. No one is burdened with excessive labor, while others remain idle. At the same time, no one is excluded from contributing. Labor becomes a shared responsibility rather than a condition imposed on some for the benefit of others. This redistribution of work changes the experience of life. When basic needs are secured and labor is balanced, people are no longer driven by necessity alone. They have time to develop their minds, to engage in learning, reflection, and cultural activity. Life becomes more than survival. It becomes an opportunity for growth. Education, in this context, takes on a central role. It is not reserved for a small elite, but made accessible to all. The purpose of education is not only to transmit knowledge, but to develop judgment, to allow individuals to understand their world and their place within it. A well-ordered society depends on informed and thoughtful individuals. At the same time, Thomas More does not ignore the need for structure and discipline. A society without private property does not mean a society without order. Rules still exist, but they are oriented toward maintaining balance rather than enforcing hierarchy. Authority is present, but it is limited and accountable, designed to serve the common good rather than individual power. This raises the question of freedom. In a system where behavior is guided by shared principles and collective organization, what happens to individual choice? More approaches this carefully. Freedom, in his view, is not simply the ability to act without restriction. It is the ability to live well within a structure that supports human flourishing. A person who is free in a disordered society may still be constrained by poverty, by lack of opportunity, or by social pressure. A person within a well-ordered system may accept certain limits, but gains a deeper form of freedom through security, education, and participation in a balanced community. This idea challenges the assumption that freedom and structure are always opposed. It suggests that the right kind of structure can enhance freedom rather than diminish it. The question is not whether limits exist, but what those limits serve. Religion also plays a role in this vision, but it is approached in a way that emphasizes tolerance and unity rather than division. Different beliefs are allowed to coexist, as long as they do not disrupt the stability of the community. The focus is not on enforcing a single doctrine, but on maintaining harmony among different perspectives. This tolerance reflects a broader principle within his philosophy, that diversity can exist within unity as long as there is a shared commitment to the common good. Uniformity is not required. What matters is balance and cooperation. At the same time, this ideal society is not presented without tension. There are elements that raise questions about individuality, conformity, and the role of authority. The system requires a high degree of participation and agreement. It assumes a level of rationality and cooperation that may not always be present. These tensions are not weaknesses to be ignored. They are part of the philosophical exploration. By presenting a society that is more balanced in some ways, he also reveals the complexities involved in achieving that balance. The vision is not a simple solution, but a way of thinking through the problems of real societies. As this philosophy develops, it becomes clear that Thomas More is not offering a single answer, but a method of inquiry. By contrasting what exists with what could exist, he creates a space for critical reflection. The goal is not to replace one fixed system with another, but to open the possibility of change. This method has a lasting impact. It encourages a way of thinking that does not accept social structures as given, but examines them in terms of their consequences. It asks whether they promote balance, fairness, and human development, or whether they sustain inequality and limitation. In this way, Thomas More moves from the critique of his own society to a broader philosophical position, where the organization of human life is seen as something that can be shaped, evaluated, and improved, where justice is not an abstract ideal, but something that must be built into the structure of everyday life, and where the possibility of a better society remains open, not as a fixed blueprint, but as a continuous effort to bring human arrangements closer to balance and coherence. As this vision of a restructured society becomes more defined, the focus begins to shift from broad principles to the deeper mechanics of how such a society sustains itself over time. Because for Thomas More, it is not enough to imagine a balanced system. One must understand how that balance is maintained, how human tendencies are guided, and how order persists without collapsing back into inequality. At the center of this question is human nature itself. A system built on shared resources and collective responsibility assumes a certain level of cooperation, but More does not simply assume that people will act well on their own. Instead, he places strong emphasis on the formation of habits, education, and the shaping of desire. People are not naturally fixed in their behavior. They're influenced by the structures around them. This means that a well-ordered society must cultivate the kinds of attitudes that support its stability. From an early stage, individuals are guided toward moderation, responsibility, and awareness of the common good. This guidance is not imposed through constant force. but reinforced through daily practice, shared expectations, and a culture that values balance over excess. Work in this system becomes one of the primary ways this balance is expressed. Labor is not treated as a burden placed on some while others are exempt. It is distributed in a way that ensures participation without exhaustion. Each person contributes, but no one is overwhelmed. This distribution reduces resentment and prevents the formation of rigid class divisions. At the same time, work is not allowed to consume life entirely. Because resources are shared and production is organized efficiently, less time is required to meet basic needs. This creates space for other activities, particularly those that develop the mind. Study, reflection, and learning are not secondary pursuits. They are essential parts of life. This emphasis on intellectual development reflects a deeper belief that a stable society depends on understanding. When individuals are capable of thinking clearly, they are less likely to be driven by impulse or manipulated by appearance. Knowledge becomes a stabilizing force, reducing the likelihood of disorder arising from ignorance. However, this does not mean that everyone is expected to pursue the same path. While education is universal, individuals may develop different strengths and interests. The system allows for variation within a structured framework. What matters is not uniformity, but contribution to the overall balance. Authority within this society is also shaped by these principles. Leaders are not elevated as a separate class with distinct privileges, but selected based on their ability to maintain order and serve the common good. Their role is functional rather than dominant. They guide, coordinate, and make decisions, but they remain accountable to the structure they operate within. This accountability is crucial. Without it, authority could easily become a source of imbalance. By limiting power and embedding it within a system of shared responsibility, the risk of corruption is reduced. Authority exists, but does not stand above the principles that govern society. Law, in this context, takes on a different character. It is not designed to punish excessively or to protect the interests of a few. Instead, it aims to maintain balance and resolve conflicts in a way that restores harmony. Because the conditions that lead to crime are minimized, the need for harsh punishment is reduced. This reflects one of More's central insights, that many social problems are not the result of individual failure alone, but of structural imbalance. When inequality is reduced and basic needs are met, the motivations for harmful behavior decrease. Law becomes less about control and more about maintaining stability. At the same time, there is an awareness that no system can eliminate all forms of conflict. Differences in opinion, desire, and perspective will still exist. The goal is not to remove these differences, but to manage them within a framework that prevents them from leading to lasting division. This is where the idea of tolerance becomes particularly important. Religious and philosophical differences are allowed, as long as they do not undermine the cohesion of the society. This creates space for diversity without allowing fragmentation. Unity is maintained not through uniform belief, but through shared commitment to the structure that supports all. This balance between unity and diversity reflects a broader principle within More's philosophy. A society must be coherent enough to function, but flexible enough to accommodate variation. Too much rigidity leads to suppression, while too much fragmentation leads to instability. The challenge is to maintain a dynamic equilibrium. As this equilibrium is maintained, the experience of life within such a society begins to change. The constant pressure associated with competition for resources is reduced. People are not driven by the fear of loss or the need to accumulate excessively. This allows for a different orientation toward life, one that values stability, understanding, and participation over acquisition. At the same time, this does not eliminate ambition entirely. It redirects it. Instead of striving for personal wealth or status, individuals are encouraged to develop their abilities and contribute to the common good. Achievement is measured not by accumulation, but by alignment with the principles of the society. This redirection of ambition is essential for maintaining balance. Without it, even a well-designed system could begin to shift toward inequality. By shaping what people value, the society influences the direction of effort, ensuring that individual goals support rather than undermine the collective structure. Yet even within this carefully constructed system, a certain tension remains. The reliance on shared principles and collective organization raises questions about individuality and spontaneity. How much freedom can exist within such a structured environment, and how much structure is necessary to preserve freedom itself? Moore does not resolve this tension completely. Instead, he allows it to remain as part of the philosophical exploration. The system he presents is both a critique of existing conditions and a test of possibilities. It shows what might be gained through balance, but also what must be considered when pursuing it. In this way, the philosophy continues to unfold, moving from the critique of inequality toward a deeper examination of how a just society can sustain itself, how human behavior can be shaped without being suppressed, and how structure and freedom can coexist within a system that aims not for perfection, but for a more balanced and coherent form of human life. As this vision continues to deepen, the philosophy begins to turn toward a more subtle and difficult question, not just how a balanced society can be created or maintained, but how it can endure without losing its purpose over time. Because even a well-ordered structure can gradually drift, shaped by habit, complacency, or the quiet return of inequality in new forms. Thomas More becomes increasingly aware that no system remains stable simply because it was well designed at the beginning. The true challenge lies in preserving its principles across generations, ensuring that the values of balance, fairness, and shared responsibility do not fade into routine or become empty forms that people follow without understanding. This leads to a deeper emphasis on internal awareness rather than external structure alone. Laws, institutions, and systems can guide behavior, but they cannot fully replace judgment. A society remains stable not only because of its rules, but because its people continue to understand why those rules exist and what they are meant to protect. Without this understanding, even the most balanced system can begin to shift. Shared property could slowly become uneven in practice. Authority could become less accountable. Work could become unevenly distributed. These changes may not happen suddenly, but through small adjustments that accumulate over time, gradually altering the structure. To prevent this, the philosophy places increasing importance on reflection. Individuals must not only participate in the system, but remain aware of its purpose. They must be capable of recognizing when imbalance begins to appear and willing to correct it before it becomes entrenched. This creates a dynamic relationship between the individual and the system. The system shapes behavior, but individuals also sustain the system through their understanding and participation. Stability is not imposed from above. It is maintained through continuous engagement. At the same time, this awareness introduces a more complex view of freedom. Earlier, freedom was understood as the ability to live well within a balanced structure. Now it becomes clear that freedom also includes the ability to question that structure when necessary. A society that cannot be examined risks becoming rigid, even if it was originally just. This openness to questioning does not undermine stability. It protects it. By allowing space for critique, the system avoids becoming fixed in a way that prevents adaptation. Change, when guided by understanding, becomes a means of preserving balance rather than disrupting it. This leads to a more flexible conception of order. Order is not a fixed arrangement that must remain unchanged. It is a condition that must be continually reestablished as circumstances shift. New challenges, new conditions, and new forms of imbalance will arise, and the system must be capable of responding to them. In this sense, the ideal society is not static. It evolves not by abandoning its principles, but by applying them in changing contexts. The core idea of balance remains, but its expression may vary depending on the conditions that emerge. This adaptability also extends to how the society relates to the outside world. It cannot remain completely isolated from other systems that operate on different principles. Trade, interaction, and contact with other societies introduce new influences, new desires, and new pressures that could affect internal balance. Managing these influences becomes another challenge. The society must engage with the outside world without absorbing the imbalances it seeks to avoid. This requires a strong internal coherence, where the principles of balance are clear enough to withstand external pressure. At the same time, this interaction raises questions about universality. Is the model presented meant for all societies, or is it a reflection shaped by specific conditions? More does not insist on a single universal system. Instead, he presents a framework that can be adapted, suggesting that the principles of balance and fairness may take different forms in different contexts. This flexibility reinforces the idea that philosophy, in this case, is not a rigid blueprint, but a method of thinking. It provides tools for evaluating and reshaping social structures rather than prescribing a single fixed solution. As this method develops, the role of imagination becomes more significant. The vision of an alternative society is not only a proposal, it is a way of expanding what is considered possible. By imagining a different arrangement of life, the limitations of the present become more visible. This imaginative aspect is essential because it allows individuals to step outside the assumptions of their own time. What appears natural or inevitable may in fact be contingent. By comparing different possibilities, one can begin to see which aspects of society are necessary and which are constructed. At the same time, this imagination is grounded in practical concerns. The goal is not to escape reality, but to understand it more clearly by contrast. The imagined society highlights the flaws of existing systems, but also reveals the difficulties involved in creating alternatives. This balance between critique and construction defines the mature stage of the philosophy. It does not settle into a single conclusion. Instead, it remains active, continually examining, adjusting, and questioning. There is also a growing awareness that no system can fully eliminate tension. Even in a balanced society, differences in perspective, desire, and interpretation will remain. The goal is not to remove these tensions, but to prevent them from becoming destructive. This requires a culture that values dialogue, patience, and mutual understanding. Conflict, when handled within a framework of shared principles, becomes a source of adjustment rather than division. It reveals areas where balance may need to be restored. As this perspective becomes more complete, the idea of justice itself is transformed. Justice is no longer a fixed set of rules or outcomes. It is an ongoing process of maintaining balance within a changing system. It requires attention, awareness, and a willingness to act when imbalance appears. In this way, Thomas More's philosophy moves beyond the initial contrast between existing society and an ideal alternative, and into a deeper exploration of how any society can remain just over time, how it can adapt without losing its purpose, and how individuals and structures must work together to sustain a form of life that remains balanced, coherent, and responsive to the conditions it faces. As this vision reaches its fullest depth, everything begins to come together into a single, continuous understanding where critique, imagination, structure, and human behavior are no longer separate elements, but parts of one ongoing process. What began as an examination of an unjust society and an imagined alternative now reveals itself as something more fundamental, a way of thinking about human life that is never fixed, always questioning, and always oriented toward balance. At this final stage, it becomes clear that Thomas More is not offering a perfect society to be copied, but a method for seeing. The imagined order is not meant to replace reality in a simple way. It is meant to expose the assumptions that shape reality, to show that what exists is not inevitable, and to open the possibility that it could be otherwise. This realization changes the role of philosophy itself. It is no longer limited to describing the world or proposing abstract ideals. It becomes a tool for transformation, not through sudden revolution, but through continuous reflection. The purpose is not to arrive at a final system, but to remain capable of evaluating and reshaping the systems that already exist. Within this framework, justice is no longer something that can be fully achieved once and for all. It becomes something that must be maintained, protected, and constantly redefined as conditions change. Every society, no matter how balanced it appears, carries within it the possibility of imbalance. Wealth can accumulate, power can concentrate, and structures can drift away from their original purpose. Because of this, the responsibility for justice cannot be placed entirely on institutions. It must also exist within individuals. A society remains fair only as long as its members remain aware, engaged, and willing to question. Without this awareness, even the best structures can become empty, followed in form but not in spirit. This introduces a deeper connection between personal responsibility and social order. The individual is not separate from the system, nor completely determined by it. Each person participates in maintaining or disrupting balance through their actions, their judgments, and their willingness to think beyond what is given. At the same time, this does not mean that responsibility is equal in all directions. Structures still matter. Conditions still shape behavior. A society that creates inequality will generate different outcomes than one that distributes resources more evenly. The point is not to reduce everything to individual choice, but to recognize the interaction between structure and agency. This interaction becomes the core of the philosophy. A just society requires both well-designed systems and thoughtful individuals. One without the other cannot sustain balance. Structure without awareness becomes rigid and potentially oppressive. Awareness without structure becomes ineffective and unable to organize collective life. As this balance is maintained, the idea of freedom reaches its most complete form. Freedom is no longer understood as simple independence or the absence of constraint. It becomes the ability to live within a system that supports human development while remaining open to examination and change. It is the freedom to participate, to understand, and to contribute to the ongoing shaping of society. This form of freedom does not eliminate limits. It redefines them. Limits are no longer seen only as restrictions, but as elements that make shared life possible. The question is not whether limits exist, but whether they serve balance and fairness or reinforce inequality and control. At the same time, the role of imagination remains essential even at this final stage. Without the ability to imagine alternatives, the present becomes fixed in thought, even if it is not fixed in reality. Imagination keeps the system open, allowing for new possibilities to be considered when existing structures begin to fail. This openness prevents stagnation. It ensures that society does not become trapped in its own forms. Change remains possible, not as a break from order, but as a continuation of the effort to maintain it. The ideal is never fully reached, but it continues to guide adjustment. There is also a deeper acceptance of tension as a permanent feature of human life. The balance between individual desire and collective need, between stability and change, between authority and freedom, is never fully resolved. It must be managed continuously. Any attempt to eliminate tension entirely risks creating a new form of imbalance. Recognizing this leads to a more realistic and grounded view of society. Perfection is not the goal. Coherence is. A society can be stable, fair, and humane without being flawless. The presence of difficulty does not indicate failure, but reflects the complexity of maintaining balance over time. As this understanding becomes more complete, the imagined society takes on a different role. It is no longer simply a model to be admired or criticized. It becomes a mirror, reflecting both the limitations of existing systems and the possibilities for improvement. It invites comparison, not imitation. In this way, Thomas More's philosophy remains active rather than settled. It does not close with a final answer, but continues as a process of questioning and adjustment. It encourages a way of thinking that remains alert to imbalance, open to change, and committed to the idea that human life can be organized more fairly than it often is. What remains is a vision of society as something constructed, sustained, and reshaped over time, where justice is not given but made, where balance is not permanent but pursued, and where the responsibility for that pursuit is shared across both individuals and the structures they inhabit. In the end, the deepest insight is not about a particular system of property, labor, or governance, but about the possibility of thinking differently about the world that already exists, recognizing that it is neither fixed nor complete, and that through reflection, imagination, and collective effort, it can move closer to a form of life that is more balanced, more coherent, and more fully aligned with the conditions that allow human beings to live not only in order, but with understanding.